Thank you, Sophie, and thank you all very much for the opportunity to explore with you today just a little bit about the work that myself and some colleagues have been doing at Melbourne Business School with executives and managers on the process of bringing mindfulness into leadership and into the work we do. So just a few things about myself. I'm not a scientist, I'm a teacher, and so I need to disappoint you now. There'll be no slides of brains or even graphs. And this is exploratory work that we're doing. So in a sense, I'm sharing with you some of the practices and some of the ways that we've been teaching and engaging with managers, and just seeing what happens, seeing what are some of the effects of those activities. So a couple of questions that I'd like to explore with you. How might being mindful change workplaces and leadership? What are some practical ways of being mindful at work? What can happen? And what are some of the consequences for individuals, groups, and organisations? So a little bit, just a bit of history about how I came to be interested in this particular relationship between mindfulness and leadership. It really grew out of my own experience and, to some degree, my own life. My observation, and I've been at Melbourne Business School for rather an embarrassingly long time for somebody whose title includes Professor of Change. Early on in that period, as I sort of made my way up the academic hierarchy and gained responsibility and so on, and began researching people's experiences of leadership and work, I started to realise that, or I started to see that workplaces are often sites of a great deal of suffering. So my observations in the research that I was doing suggested to me that there were some things that we needed to learn about what was going on in those workplaces that would help us make change. And when I turned my focus to looking at leadership practices, the way leaders went about their work, and I'd like to say here that when I'm talking about leadership, I'm really talking about that broad range of activities that involves influencing others. So while, of course, we're interested in people in formal positions of power and authority in organisations, we're also very interested in all of the ways in which parents lead their children, the ways in which children sometimes also lead their parents. We're interested in the way in which people out in the community show leadership in voluntary capacities, in organisations and so on. We're interested in how teachers lead, how school principals lead. So defining that notion of leadership very broadly. But when I started to explore the impact of leadership in all of these sites, where there was a lot of suffering, the finding or the observation that was immediately obvious to me was that leadership was often a force that imprisoned people, that enslaved people, rather than freeing people. So my own experience from watching, observing leaders, was that both the practice of leadership and the sort of concepts and theories and ideas that we brought to leadership and about how leadership should be done often had this impact of imprisoning and enslaving not just leaders but also their followers. What do I mean by that? Well, from this observation, I saw that leadership as a kind of a role seemed to often require leaders to work unsustainably, to surrender their values, in order to get the job done, to lose sight of their purpose, to lose connection with their colleagues and their subordinates, to really, in a sense, get caught up in the performance of a particular way of doing the work of leadership that really impacted in very significant ways, again, on both the leader and their followers. So I started to explore the leadership literature for explanations and insights about how to do leadership in ways that were more freeing. And what I found was that the leadership literature was incredibly barren on that topic. There wasn't much help there. And as part of my training to be a yoga teacher, which I am also, and my exploration of yoga philosophy and then Buddhist meditation and Buddhist philosophy, I started to find some new answers to this question about how leadership might be different. And so a lot of my work now has been about bringing those two ideas together, the idea of mindfulness and the idea of leadership. So what do I mean by mindfulness at work? You know, what does this phenomenon sort of look like? And what kind of a definition of mindful leadership might we usefully draw on? In the sessions over the 2 days, and hasn't it been a most amazing couple of days? It's just been so invigorating and inspiring to hear from all of the people that we have. But we have had a couple of different definitions of mindfulness that are quite useful. So one that is often used is the notion of simply paying attention without judgment. That's a definition developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn. And it's quite a nice, simple definition. It sort of captures some of what we're interested in exploring. Present moment awareness. So it captures something of being truly present right here and right now, and the power of being present right here and right now, as opposed to having our mind somewhere else, as opposed to having a whole lot of thoughts rattling through our minds. So this idea of mindfulness really does have a strong emphasis on presence, and it has a strong emphasis on connection. So in ensuring that our interactions with others are not mechanical, they really do come from some place that's grounded and heartfelt. In terms of mindful leadership, we're often asked for definitions of this, and myself and my colleagues have sort of experimented with different definitions to capture what we might mean by mindful leadership. But interestingly enough, when we offer those definitions, they just don't seem to go anywhere. They fall a bit flat. And what we've found is that actually giving people the experience of being more mindful while they are practicing the exercise of leadership is the best thing. So here, of course, we're also connecting to the Buddha's teachings. And the Buddha said, you know, don't trust gurus, don't trust experts, trust your own experience, trust your practice as the teacher. And certainly that's what we've found. So just a word very briefly about some of the things that we draw on in mindful leadership. You'll see from that diagram that there are a whole range of influences and a whole set of research that we draw on, including the research that's been so wonderfully explored over the last 2 days. What I'd like to just draw your attention to is that, in our view, the best of the leadership work really has a very close connection and synergy with ideas about mindfulness. So emerging work by people like Ron Heifetz, who works at the Kennedy School of Government in the US, Heifetz talks about the importance of getting on the balcony in leadership, of developing perspective, of seeing what's going on from another place and being able to intervene very thoughtfully and mindfully in the action. Other people like Otto Scharmer, who's at MIT, and some of his colleagues are really, really interested in how organisational transformation can be seized through using practices that we would recognise as mindfulness practices. So practice of being very attentive and observant to the cracks and opportunities in situations. Being able to connect more deeply with people in order to let, as Sharma describes it, future possibilities emerge through you. And so these approaches require a high level of attentiveness, along with a sort of diminished ego. So when we're working in this way, the self is not foregrounded. The needs of the self are not right up front. It's an approach that I describe in my work as less ego leadership. So there's lots of interesting emerging research in the leadership domain that seems to be very nicely connected to mindfulness. So let me just describe 5 things that we do when we work with leaders on developing mindfulness. And as I describe these, I just want to highlight a point that was made in the panel session before afternoon tea. Leadership is a field, it's described as, by many as more studied than any other area, certainly of business and management. So there's an enormous amount of material out there on leadership. And really that's a problem, because people have lots of templates and advice and how-to books that tell them how they should be in leadership. And all of that advice can often get in the way of getting in touch with some different way of doing it. So the first thing that we do is simply slow everything down. And encourage people to become much more observant about what's going on right here and now. What's going on with cues, with our own bodily cues, but also what's going on in the external environment and with others. Now, leaders are often taught, the script about leadership is doing. Great deeds are the mark of leaders. Action is the mark of leaders. And what we often try and do as part of our work is to encourage leaders to do less doing and more being. In our experience, when people are working with leaders who are practicing like this, their experience is that more powerful and effective leadership, there is less said and less done, but it has more impact. And it actually draws more out of you. So this slowing down process seems to be very critical. Along with it, of course, go all of the skills of deep listening, of really deep listening. And most of us think that we listen, but of course, as soon as we start to work in this space, we realise that we're not listening, we're actually what one theorist describes as reloading. But deep listening moves groups. So the cultivation of deep listening and what my colleague Richard Searle describes as stillness in action can be a very powerful thing to do. Just a word about that. This process of slowing down the action often gets very, very strong responses from people. People often don't want to slow down. They're running really hard. They're certainly the people we work with are often running really hard. And so that activity of encouraging them to slow can be a very, very confronting thing. Suddenly it starts to reveal, it allows space to see the sacrifices that they've made, the trade-offs that they've made as part of being so incredibly busy. So part of our work is sort of sitting with that response. Second thing, being present to and observant of what's going on with others. So again, in the leadership field, a lot of the focus is on the future. It's all about achieving outcomes, performance outcomes and so on, KPIs and all of that sort of thing. But our experience is that relentless focus on the future in organisations, in leadership, is often a way of completely avoiding being properly present. And being properly present is what counts. Certainly in your own working experience, I'm sure you notice when somebody is truly present to you. It's very palpable. It's described in the leadership literature as authentic leadership. And in our earlier panel session, we also heard from Evian, talking about the value and importance of authenticity in relation to emotion. So being present, part of that is about being emotionally present and being prepared to disclose vulnerability. And of course, again, leaders have often been told that vulnerability is absolute no-go, that's never expressed. Experiencing interconnection. So one of the concepts is that leadership is done from above or in front of groups, but in fact, we believe that it's done from within. Developing the courage and capacity to name what's really going on is part of what we encourage too. Finding ways of being able to explore points of conflict, points of difference. And again, this is tricky leadership work. The Dalai Lama has a lovely definition of what leaders should do. And that is that leaders should build a strong and warm heart for an organisation, and to see and say things as they really are. Requires an enormous amount of courage to do that. And to experiment and let go, and often that involves letting go of very tightly held scripts about how people must be as leaders. Let me just flip to this one very quickly. What can happen, and these are just some of the things that we see. Of course, it's not with everyone, but perhaps the most powerful sort of indicator that the work is worth doing for us is the fact that people, after they experiment with some of these ideas and get some practice in greater stillness, greater listening, is they initiate very different kinds of conversations, both at work and at home. And it also invites people to find a great deal more joy and happiness in their work, which just seems very profoundly important to us. One thing also that seems to happen is a greater level of appreciation of what's happening here and now. A greater level of appreciation about how others contribute to our own well-being. So I want to finish with a small invitation or an exercise that I'm going to invite you to do. I'd like you to pair up with somebody alongside you and just spend a moment or two alternately describing something that you are grateful for. It might be something that's happened over the conference. It might be something you might be feeling extremely grateful for the Dalai Lama's presence this morning. So just take a moment to do that. Thank you very much for your attention today.